The sun had barely risen, casting a dim light over the barren steppe as I crouched in the dirt, my rifle tight in my hands, the smell of oil and gunpowder in the air. The ground beneath me was hard, cold, unyielding. The silence that had filled the hours before the battle was now broken by the sound of artillery being readied. Far off in the distance, I could hear the heavy rumble of tank engines. We all knew the plan, a massive push, an all-out offensive that would send the Soviets running. But there was no running here. We were headed into the heart of the storm. The first shell landed, distant but deafening. A deep tremor underfoot. It was like the earth itself was reacting to the explosion. And with it, the battle had begun. We had been preparing for days, lining up our tanks, those beasts of iron and fire, and making sure everything was ready. We were going to strike hard and strike fast, catching them off guard. The Soviets had been digging in for months, but we, the Wehrmacht, had the momentum. Or at least, that's what we were told. I could feel the tension among the men around me. A quiet hum of nervous energy that matched the sound of the artillery pounding the horizon. "Stay sharp," my lieutenant said, his voice steady but eyes searching the distance. He was a veteran, one of the few who had survived the horrors of Stalingrad and come back to lead. But today I could see the shadow of doubt in his eyes. Even he wasn't certain. No one was. "Here they come," a voice shouted, and I snapped my head up to see the first wave of Tiger tanks rumbling toward the front line. The massive machines moved slowly, like lumbering beasts, their thick armor gleaming under the morning light. I had seen them up close before, those enormous cannons on their turrets, the steel-clad sides that could shrug off most of what the Russians had thrown at us. "Form up," a sergeant barked, and we scrambled into position. My heart was in my throat, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. It was the calm before the storm, the stillness before the blood would begin to flow. I could taste the dust in the air. The world seemed to hold its breath. I took a deep breath, and with a final glance at my comrades, we moved forward, joining the line of men marching behind the tanks. The first shot came out of nowhere, a loud, sharp crack that echoed across the battlefield. I felt the shockwave rip through the air, even from a distance. A Soviet shell had hit one of our tanks. It exploded in a blaze of fire, sending metal shards flying in every direction. The tank's turret was blown off like a tin can, and in an instant, it was reduced to nothing but a smoldering wreck. The men around me froze, staring at the wreckage, wide-eyed, but then like clockwork, the push continued. We couldn't afford to stop. "Keep moving," the sergeant shouted again, his voice shaking with urgency. But even as I sprinted forward, I could feel the unease growing. The Russians weren't just retreating. No, they were waiting. They were prepared. We advanced further, the pounding of artillery continuing to shake the earth beneath us. There was no real sense of control, no clear direction. It was chaos. The tanks ahead of us pushed forward, plowing through the Soviet defenses, but I could see the flash of Soviet artillery firing back. The Russians weren't just sitting behind their lines, they were coming to meet us head-on. And then the sound of T-34's Russian tanks, faster, nimbler than our own massive Tigers. Their engines roared as they rushed at us from the opposite side of the field. It wasn't like the Hollywood films, no dramatic moments. The tanks were fast, deadly, and they had us in their sights. My stomach twisted as I saw the silhouettes of their armored vehicles cresting the horizon, a deadly swarm. "Stay low. Stay down," one of the men shouted as the ground began to shake with incoming fire. I threw myself behind a pile of rubble, the world suddenly moving in slow motion. A Soviet tank shell slammed into the earth just a few meters away, sending a blast of hot air and dirt in all directions. I could hear the sharp crack of gunfire, and through the smoke and chaos, I saw a Russian tank turning its turret toward us. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. My thoughts were racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The Soviets were meant to break, not fight back with such force. But there was no time to question it. I raised my rifle and fired, the recoil pushing against my shoulder. I couldn't tell if I hit anything, couldn't even see the target in the haze of smoke and dust, but I kept firing. The noise was deafening. For every German tank that advanced, another Soviet T-34 would appear and explode in a flash of fire. The world around me was chaos, flashes of light, the roar of artillery, the shrieks of men screaming in pain. I could smell the acrid stench of burning fuel and the unmistakable odor of death. I heard the screams of my comrades, the dull thuds of bodies hitting the ground, and then the silence that followed. We were no longer fighting for victory. We were fighting to survive. A scream from behind me. I spun around and saw a Soviet soldier charging at me, rifle raised. My heart stopped for a second. In that split second, everything seemed to slow down. I fired instinctively, and the soldier dropped, but the fear was there. It always was. We kept advancing, but now it felt different. Our tanks were starting to falter. The shells were beginning to tear into their armored sides, and more of our men were falling, their bodies littering the field. The Russians weren't retreating, they were pushing forward, holding their ground, and with every passing minute, I felt more and more certain of one thing: we were losing. The Germans had always been known for their discipline, their tactics, their precision. But today, it felt like everything was slipping away. We were no longer the unstoppable force, the master of war we had been told we were. We were just men, fighting for our lives, with nothing but the enemy ahead and the blood of our brothers behind us. And yet we kept moving forward, step by step, knowing that victory or death were the only choices left. And the battle, it was far from over.